an experience that oftentimes is not told and not considered very important by mainstream Americans. So I know in New England, just like in New York, a lot of this material is not collected by the local historical societies or the state historical societies, only now that it's being taken seriously. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in New York. So we have an exhibit at the New York Historical Society about Chinese exclusion and about the lives of Chinese in the Americas and the United States, what led up to the point of exclusion, but also what happened after exclusion. We also have an exhibit opening, 2 exhibits opening at the Museum of Chinese in America. One exhibit about 35 years of collecting materials and why it's important. So I hope you can come to that show because it very much is similar to the work that you've been doing here. But also an exhibit of the artwork who does these prints by name Philip Tchen, who's from Chicago, and that's where I'm from as well. And it's his artwork, and I'll tell you a little bit about his work in a little bit. And then the following week, we have an exhibit on the Eugenics Records Office that was in Cold Spring Harbor that was ground zero of the eugenics movement. And I'll talk a little bit about that because Chinese exclusion and the exclusion of other Asians in this country then led to the European attitudes that somehow Europeans had also racial order, and that the law was talking about the superior Europeans, the northern Nordic, the northwestern Europeans, who were then superior to the Alpine Europeans. Actually, they were really talking about Jewish people, for example, and the Mediterranean Europeans, who were the Italians, the Greeks, the Spanish. That was the hierarchy. So the immigration laws passed in the national origins quota in 1924 was an extension of Chinese exclusion, saying that these groups of people should not be coming to this country either, because they would be making this country less and less, they would pollute the racial germplasm, is what they talked about. So we're doing an exhibit about that because it shows the connection between, let's say, research, what appears to be academic research. The director of that was a professor of biology here at Harvard University. And it was funded by the Carnegie Institute. It was funded by Mary Harriman, Averill Harriman's, the Averill Harriman family. So we're talking about a history that is not known, just in the same way that the Chinese Exclusion Act is not known, and just in the way that Chinese and American history is not known. Now, the reason I really feel this is important is that the biggest question that we haven't talked about in this country, among them, is a question that doesn't even have a name. But it's an unresolved issue between the US and China, and the US and Asia. And that unresolved issue started even before the Boston Tea Party, when they threw Chinese tea in Boston Harbor. So it really formulated, in some ways, the basic unresolved issue between the US and China, especially in terms of trade, but also what these trade items represented. And it continued through the very first people who came to this country and came to Canada. And then it continues to this day with the unresolved issues in terms of the great crises of our time, which is global climate change, and the inability of China and the US to cooperate on things like solar panels. So the very future of our survival as a people depends on this problem. But nobody's really quite given a name because it's one of those issues that is very hard for Americans and Chinese to deal with. And I think we can call it something that was named in the 19th century, but we should continue to call it a name today. That's the Chinese question. The Chinese question is the unresolved relationship between this country and China, in part because this country has all sorts of misconceptions and stereotypes. So the Yellow Peril book is trying to help analyze what that long history is all about, that precedes this country and goes all the way back into European history. And how the Chinese question is something that is unresolved. It was unresolved at the moment of the Boston Tea Party. And there have been efforts at different points in time to resolve that question in terms of treaties, trade questions. But then it gets brought up again in terms of perceptions of Chinese cheap labor and how that's unfair competition to the US, and that leads up to the Chinese Exclusion Law. It continues later on through the eugenics period to the period in which 1943, finally, the law is repealed, but the only reason it was repealed is because now China is an ally with the United States fighting the war against Japan. So the impressions of the good Japanese and the bad Chinese gets flipped. It all of a sudden becomes the good Chinese and the bad Japanese. But the repeal has no meaning, because in 1943, only 105 people a year come to this country from China. And the reason why it's 105 people a year is because it goes back to the eugenics-defined national origins quota. So all of a sudden, then Chinese then get caught up in a racially divisive, racially dangerous policy that was developed from eugenics. And then it's unresolved to this day. We can continue talking. It's unresolved to this day, in which the Chinese question and the perception that most Americans have that China owes the largest part of the American debt. And it's just not true. But if you were to poll most Americans outside of maybe major metropolitan areas, Americans really have believed that, and they especially believe it during midterm and four-year elections, when there's a lot of political ads basically making that case in a very disingenuous way. Part of the great foresight of the founding fathers of this nation was that no other country as a revolution can own the American debt except America. So China does own a part of the American debt, but so do many other countries. And people who really understand how these things work will say this is just an exaggeration. It's just, but it's really worse than that. It's really untrue. But this notion that China is the future potential partner, friend, or the constant, perhaps, menace and enemy of the United States is an expression of this Chinese question that until it's resolved, it's going to be perhaps potentially disastrous to all of our futures and to the possible solutions for global climate change. So then the question is, well, if we can't give it a name, then how can we deal with it? 2 years ago, I think all of the people at the Historical Society know that the Congress, through the leadership of Judy Yu, Congresswoman Judy Yu, had passed a resolution giving not apologies but regrets for the Chinese Exclusion Act. But the problem with that 2 years ago is that most people didn't even know that there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, so that when there's some apology, it actually got very little coverage. So the difficulty that we all face now is that the Chinese Exclusion Act and its ongoing impacts in terms of the Chinese question is something that is not understood by the broad American public. And in fact, probably many of our own families don't even understand its ongoing significance. Oh, it's something that happened in the past, it was repealed, it's changed, but in fact, it has an ongoing impact. So the question becomes, how do we deal with that? And that's part of why we've been working on these exhibitions, and also a film that Rick Burns is working on about the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So we're hoping for the first time in American history that Americans will have a chance to really focus on this question and have this history be a part of the history of this country, just like the history of slavery is a part of the history, right? It's difficult for us as Americans to deal with. How does any country want to deal with difficult issues? And I have to say, though, we have to confront it. We have to acknowledge the difficult parts of American history, as well as the promises that this country and the possibilities that this country has offered many of our families